고유견 통고 말해. 고유견 마서나 고발에 탈되게 삼바 내중 기르고 말해. 해서지 어도 쉬버래. 대자당 이제 나 고발이야. 아니 견 통해야 되라. 가르섬 당고래서는 언제야. 아니 고유 동화 삼다야. 고유 동화고 삼다야 되는. 지사도 씨는 고유 동화고 삼다야 되라. 나중에 어다 아니 기가나 숨게 동화에 받아 디베디 미드베 동화 안두비든 내지기 소수의 야고여 뒤에 자위게 동화 안농원 밤이베 동화 안동화이 동화 유의 동화 잡아두시 동화 어두시는 삼다웨나 아니 알코올에 균토에도 오다 균들에도 타고도 선비게 선박기도 그래서 감솔라 신비신바디 말에서 다 감솔라 신비 신바디 도비게 탑라 아니 거기 균도시는 삼당고래에서 그 생각 아디쇼게 디고시로와.
Good afternoon. So this morning we moved from having looked at the faults or the faults of clinging merely to this life to looking at the faults of clinging to the three realms in their entirety, which is that as long as one believes that there is happiness to be found through one's normal worldly activities, through and in terms of wherever one happens to be born, whatever one's status in life, perhaps one can experience happiness. As long as one is deceived by one's ignorance in this way, one will not be seeking freedom or liberation from cyclic existence, because one has the mistaken belief that there is happiness to be found in cyclic existence. So therefore, the first point is to come to recognize the faults of samsara, and to recognize that these faults of samsara pervade cyclic existence. There is no stable, lasting happiness to be found in any state within samsara. So therefore, we spoke briefly about various ways that one approaches the topic of the sufferings of samsara. For example, the suffering related to meeting the unwanted, or being separated from the wanted, suffering relating to not getting what you want, and the suffering relating to insatiability. Moreover, also spoke briefly about the suffering of physical mental pain, the suffering of transient happiness, and all-pervasive suffering of conditioning. So one needs to look at the reality of samsaric existence through this lens, so as to overcome this ignorance which deceives us in thinking that there is actually happiness to be found here. Once one has investigated deeply, repeatedly over a sustained period, then finally the wish arises to definitely emerge from the suffering realms of samsara, to attain a state of lasting happiness, of actual peace.
다 잡아두시기 동안에서디 나한저기 수기 풍보디 안제 풍보디다 레다 녀모 옹주의 풍보래 제사 잡아두시기 동안시고래 레다 녀모 옹주의 풍보디라 안에 잡아두시기 동안스 제사당 안제 풍보디 레다 녀모 풍보디 유베 긴지다 가서 깨와 깨위 동안 가위 동안 나위 지고 지위 동안디게 차상 어두신화야 되는 신의 용거래서 지사다 동아여야기 되니게 규디게야 규디가데라나 레다 녀모바니레스 지나 레이용게 깨발링고래 레디야네 녀모바옹게 올레사고래 시사다 규 레다 녀모바니데 방고고래 디나데다 조 녀모바데 방고고래 서다 방고고래 다 지사 녀모바래 지사 동아 규 녀모바다 레다 녀모바다 디 제보 다 동아 탐제 아니 동아의 동안의 규의 동안 잡아두지 동안 되게 자유하게 타르바디 덮고도 선비게 어두시네 네 삼다에 되네 덮되게 내중 기고를 해제 어두시네 대시 지역에 디고 쉬버리 당도.
The final lens I presented by which one can look at suffering or the faults of cyclic existence is that of all-pervasive suffering of conditionality, which refers to our five aggregates, this body and our minds. So these are the very basis upon which we experience suffering. It's because we have this body and mind that we suffer. So it's the very basis upon which the other lenses of suffering are mentioned, on this very basis that we experience the sufferings of birth, aging, sickness, and death, as well as those others. So where then does this contaminated aggregate, contaminated aggregates, where do they come from? They are also caused. They come about in dependence on the karma that we have accumulated. Karma too is caused. It comes about from afflictions. So it's due to the presence of afflictions that contaminated karma is accumulated. And it's this that ripens into our suffering physical and mental aggregates. So when one recognizes suffering and the basis upon which one experiences suffering, and recognizes that this basis, the physical and mental aggregates, are caused, one will seek out those causes and try to eradicate them. And the cause, being contaminated karma itself, is caused by the afflictions. So these are the main object of our focus of attention. Whilst one wants to abandon negative karma, it's really the afflictions that we look to abandon. So then as one strives, so through the process of striving to abandon the afflictions, the cause of this entire process of cyclic existence, one progresses towards the attainment of the state of liberation, where one is liberated from samsara, liberated from this process of uncontrolled birth and death, this process of birth and death being dictated by our contaminated karma and afflictions. When one is liberated from one's afflictions, one has attained the state of liberation.
아디네 자당 이제 데니기 코발을 드위게 타로 토바이나 네네 탈버기 된 토바이나 데니 아니 코르 동아디기 차사요아요 말에 동아유교 녀모바디게다 동아 녀모바디 제보 동아디 차사요아 메바레 제사 데니게자 나 코위기 코발을 드위게 타로 톱나 데니 네지 르리아 강아 메바데 르당 아니 강기 토네 강아 차사나 자와지리 사실 어두스제네 란제 디니 자가 감숨나 셴베게 셴바다 자와나 아니 셴네 예종게네 곰바이나 엔델레데네 아니 땡캬브라제 아니 지게 가소리 탈벽고바 톱델레 땡델이야 게 동화 탐제단 제위게 안도시 땡기 대화데 토고리 해서지 어두스제네 숨고르와
When liberation is achieved, one will never experience suffering again. Liberation is a state of lasting, stable happiness. And the reason one will never suffer again when one is liberated is one has completely abandoned the afflictions together with their seeds. Therefore, there are no afflictions to ripen past contaminated karma. So therefore, the causes are eradicated. The causes for suffering are eradicated. Hence, no physical or mental suffering can be experienced again. And this is then when one has attained liberation from the three realms of samsara, a state of lasting, stable happiness.
아다 타바 도비 치르다 다 람냠len 치고래네 냠len 치 곰자고래 곰나디간에 곰고래 냠len 치단 간에 리에선다 람곰야디 탑람딜라 가르치고 간에 치고래서나 나 당보 코로나다 대신한 저게 삼다이디 거기 동아디기 파견디게 삼다이들이 견 삼단에 거기 동아 견 태달은 저베다 견디네 제사 델레 타르제 탈바도 토부도 셈비 동아 탐제의 저유 견 탐제된 드라이비게 타르바세드 토부도 셈비게 삼로디 따와나 디다 코와라 예중 코와라 타르디기 견 동아 델레 타르디기 예중게네 타바도니게 삼바게 봐서 올리네 제상 거기 견디기 루션데 유저가 삼단 거기 견디네데네레데네레다 견디게 삼단 오다디 견디네서 델레데 코와 딜레데 마탄데 탑미누 셈베 삼로다 제사다 코와레 타르비고 바 토부도 셈베게 삼로디다 먼저 디 삼로디 야네 야도 당고 오래 디 예중세데 다 타바도니 로세 디시 오래 제사다 군노를 마서는 조디레다 군노를 마서는 타르바도 토부도 셈베 다 군노디 that is chawar tabadoni kunose sambasede.
So then what is the method to train in, to cultivate the required mental paths that lead to liberation? Well, the first step we discussed this morning, which is to meditate deeply on the faults of cyclic existence, the faults of samsara. This is the indispensable first step, because one needs to have the clear recognition of suffering and its causes, so as to give rise to a definite, a deep determination to emerge from the sufferings of samsara. This is the mind of definite emergence. This is when one becomes a renunciate, where one is definite about emerging from the suffering realms of samsara into the state of lasting, stable happiness of liberation. So that is the very motivation that one needs to develop in order to cultivate the actual paths that will lead to liberation. So the first step, meditating on the faults of samsara, is cultivating the motivation that's required, because meditating on the faults of samsara will eventually lead to a determined attitude to emerge from suffering.
토부도 셈비게 삼바디도 장제 아주길라 쮸마마이 버지께서나 데네 람길에 깨와래라고 그러다 쮸마마이 비께바이나 아주길에 깨바이나 람길에 깨워 이중에 삼바길에 깨와래 람길에 깨와래서 그래.
That is the motivation then that is required in order to cultivate the required mental paths. And when the mental paths are developed in a way that is uncontrived, it is then that one finally has a path, has developed a strength of mind that can be called a mental path. So this would be with uncontrived definite emergence. Uncontrived in that one doesn't need to manufacture it. It's not contrived. It's rather spontaneously arises because of one's deep familiarity with it.
나 되네 저 되네 당하로 죽을라 예중에 삼바데 되네게 쮸마마인 바지 매바인자 당하로 두시네 디삼로 땅이 되네게 콜규견다 견다 수삼르시다 되네 코발을 주에 타바 토구도 선배 삼르시다 되네 타바 토위 토고인자다 타바 토위 얘기 된다라 안다 냠는 가르치 오래서네 가상슈바나시레 달루가 이승이 예주든 비추림 예주 자오기는 지금에 선배 삼다야데 류가 이승이 예주든 비추림 차고래 되네 안디셀이야 소소기 로주다 되네게 시행심절 폐도 진바 당기인지 비진바 셴리아 달리아 건조래 쳐보피야래 셴 마 셴리아 네 파티 진바다에 당기인지 비게 삼로 차야 되리 아니 된자야 되네 쇠버 거미야 되지 단대지 쇠버 거미야 되니까 셴게 란래 강아가제 진뇌로 녀버기야다 강아 제베네 파 콩랑하지 콩랑랑 셈투 콩랑랑 파 네빌렌 지금에 셈베 삼다이다 쇠버 거미야 제거래 어디나신다 되네게 기회 냠는 제와다 배 야부이게다 진디네 고가 배 야부이 되네 이 무주생의 지긴 셈베 삼다이디 나 되네게 기회 저 가와 제발을 쪼와 되네 무주세와 삼다이디 전주 냠는 제스리 가상 냠는 슈바나지리 어두시네 다 냠는 제디 디르 군로디 콜웰을 줘야지 타르바 토부 셈비 군이라 다 타르바 토고에서 타르바 토베에 된다라 가르가르 냠는 제고르세는 안두시 오래서지 도두시.
There's uncontrived definite emergence. Then is the mind still to cultivate. How to cultivate it? Well, it's meditating on the faults of samsara repeatedly over a sustained period, so that a uncontrived, determined attitude to abandon cyclic existence and attain the state of liberation arises. That is the mind of uncontrived definite emergence, and that is the attainment of the mental path of uncontrived definite emergence. But that is the motivation required to achieve liberation. What are the practices, the mental trainings that are required in order to achieve liberation? So in dependence on that motivation, one needs to train in various practices. Now remembering where we are in the text, which is on the second line, which is built in dependence on the first line. So that training has already been done. So one has some good familiarity with the trainings to continue doing. So one now, with a motivation of liberation, engages in the training on ethical restraint, developing the determined attitude, I will not harm others. I will restrain my physical behavior from bringing any harm. I will restrain my speech from bringing any harm. I will even restrain my mind from bringing any harm. And in addition to restraining myself ethically so I don't bring harm, I will seek to be of benefit wherever I can. The second training, that of generosity. This can be expressed in many ways, offering to the 3 jewels, offering to those in need, and so forth. The third training is that of patience. And patience is a mind that is undisturbed in the face of adversity. So ethical restraint is a mind that is restrained from harm. Generosity is a mind that gives. And patience is a mind that is unrestrained in the face of adversity. That adversity can come from others, or it can come from one's own inner turmoil. For example, when one's losing motivation to practice. And the fourth training, which we also heard about yesterday, was that of enthusiastic perseverance, where one takes delight in virtue, where engaging in virtue, when one's mind is virtuous, one is joyous about this, one is enthusiastic about this, and therefore wants to continue strengthening one's habituation to these virtuous minds. So these are 4 steps which are required for trainings, for practices, to train one's mind in order to actually fulfill one's motivation of achieving liberation from samsara.
룡에서 예주팀의 수rim디 다양한적이 연된 탐지의 계획이 실로 마서나 디레 사신하시리 예시를 수림디 연된 탐지 계획이 시 사신하신디 돈도 차상 답이야 가르답나 영화디다 사신 약부 쉬어버 있는 데래 돈도다 신도다 가르답나 기 약부 기거로와 사지데 약부 매나 근데 약부 기투고 말와 디나시 아주 수림 예주의 룡에서 예주팀의 수림디 약부 손에디 예침버리디자 델레테네 개와치마 온디오 고방 주게디야 델레텐 주고레지레 다 코와 타달을 줘야지 타르비 토야 되라 수림송인데 델레테네 아는 개와 공부도 당주고레스 산지오 고방 토바델라야 융아이스 뉴주드베 수림송해야 되고 고레스 지다도 수림세야데베 마시기 연대 탐지기 중세계 자와 시자마선의 사신하시레서 그래.
Of these 4 causes, one to emphasize is that of ethical restraint. The importance of ethical restraint cannot be overemphasized. It's often referred to as the foundation or the basis in which all excellent qualities grow. One analogy often used is that of fertile soil in which plants can grow with ease. So ethical restraint is the foundation for any other qualities we want to give rise to. If one lacks ethics, those other qualities one may aspire to cannot come about. So therefore, the importance of ethics cannot be overemphasized. So ethics, or ethical restraint, is the cause that leads to an excellent rebirth. Without having cultivated sufficient quality of ethics, one cannot attain a good rebirth. Moreover, ethics is indispensable for the attainment of liberation from cyclic existence, and it is indispensable for the attainment of Buddhahood. So, therefore, one should know that a primary focus of one's attention must be on restraining oneself ethically.
다리 고미야디 진바 수준서 진바다 수준서바 준지해야 고미야디 가상시와 드리리 지바래 어디래 다디린 쉐디 디가라야 카르고스는데 삼데나 시럽 기념돼야지 어디 공거래 제고거래.
Yesterday we spoke a bit about ethics, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance, and that's sufficient for now. In the meditation that the practitioner is doing, they'll have some experience of these. But there are 2 additional causes that have to be cultivated in order to attain liberation. And these 2 causes we'll look at now, that of single-pointed concentration and wisdom.
저기 다 가서 체디라시나 주바민스네 체디zam기 아니 체디 코와 제게젤 파시엔진 셴바체바이나 아니 겨치마 원디오 고마 톱투 말에 디인사다 체디 유젤이야 안지 치와다 미다바 삼단 체디zam기니 제게 내다 류로절이야 셴바차바 방안진에 겨치마 원디오 고마 토바 되니게 삼바 겨오레스 제사당 원디오 고방 토예기 돈다라 냠는지에 가르스는 추tum수야 진배다야 수배 냠는지야 준리 냠는지야 안디시리에선 디 냠는지야 디시리 단 가상교슈에 디네 디링다 코리도르 타르바토고 그래서 안 타르바토야라 가르쳐 그래서는 타르바토예기 내중가 삼바 군네 삼바기 군네 삼주 군노 디토네 냠는지야디 진바 추준 세바 준리시 가상의 시지바시 안디가리아 네 가소리 삼대 신에다 네 담에부터 베셔럽스 고미야 셔럽스 고미야디 디니데 태워자고래.
So hopefully it's a little clear that this training we're talking about today builds on what was looked at yesterday. In that what we looked at yesterday, there was a particular motivation which serves the purpose of lifting one's mind up out of the distraction of this life to a greater goal, giving one a focus, a determined attitude to develop ethics, generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance. So one's mind is taken away from the mundane confines of this life towards virtue. Now, with that habituation, one can build on one's motivation and developing a far more powerful motivation, looking beyond merely the next life to full and complete liberation from cyclic existence, from samsara. So complete enlightenment from complete liberation from samsara. So what is required is a more powerful motivation, which we've spoken about, coming about through the fault, recognizing the faults of samsara. And whilst those four trainings of generosity, ethics, patience, and joyous perseverance are sufficient on their own to lead to an excellent rebirth, they are, whilst indispensable for liberation, they on their own are insufficient to achieve liberation. Therefore, in addition to developing a more powerful motivation, one needs to train in two additional trainings, that of single-pointed concentration and wisdom.
어디는 자당은 내내기 당하는 저기 류디의 지시에들라다 류디 교연 함체다 ben에 그 동아리 지나 다 겨와두지 동아리 류디를 때네 네 지게 내나사다 겨와치 동아 용어를 세대 교연이 찬에다 류디 되는데 겨와딜레데 타고도 선배 삼다의 교연이 찬에 해봐라 야 류코라를 연전 찬에 해야들 남주는 아주 당하는 류디네 단주기 류디인지 delaya anjik denegi lüdin di top kaware nye kaware jisan duen chenpore se odu shine ya lü khoro yenden chene xie ji ni ngo ro da yenden chene jisan dang han zu lü di jidang go dunga yi ra shi de delala de ne za gang yo ba di deji xie ba da ga ra de yin da yang nga zu gi dünrö da nya wa yi da dünrö shine nga zu lüdin di xera ge ya ga je nga zu lüdin delaya gewe nyamne gom nyamne ga shi na je tuye ju yong yue de re jisan denegi inza 제투야 예대 봐. 제가 당한테 류된데 동아다 좀 깨게다 빼지 그래대 이나 된텔라 류된텔이야 가지고 때 전에 그 ben에 야 지게 다들 냠는지 고발행 예중기에 탈바등에 삼바기에 대한 아주 된텔라 류된디텔라 검토거래. 되네 추춤소야라 진배 냠는지야 수배 냠는지 준리 냠는지 류된디텔라 주토거래. 맞아. 신 냐와다 이다다 류류 데네데네 주카고 땡기 전에 갈래하고 차고 냠는 저거 갈래하고 차고로 와.
An important balance to keep in one's mind is that between what we discussed this morning, that this body, this physical aggregate, is the basis upon which we experience suffering. When one gives rise to the determined attitude to emerge from cyclic existence, one is wanting to abandon a body such as this, because we have such a body that we suffer. So one needs to balance that with the recognition, though, that this rebirth we have, this human body that we have, is considered precious from a different but equally important perspective. So this precious human rebirth, or literally precious human body, is comprises of the 18 freedoms and opportunities, which means we have achieved a rebirth that is the ideal foundation upon which to achieve the causes for a further excellent rebirth and for liberation itself. For those beings who are trapped in the body of a being in the lower realms, they don't have such an opportunity. They lack the physical basis to to intentionally train their minds and thereby develop the qualities, develop the causes that are required to achieve an excellent rebirth and to achieve liberation. So this rebirth we have achieved, this human body, this human life, is something of great value because there are countless beings who do not have such an opportunity, that it is just not possible for them to train their minds and thereby cultivate causes for further excellent rebirths and liberation. We have such a basis. We have such a foundation to train in. So here, what I'm drawing your attention to is we need to have a balanced approach towards this physical body of recognizing its great potential, but also its limitations.
Kowe dunga le chaya le ha kunjung dunga yun yu kunjung nyomoba le da nyomoba sinne nyomoba de bangu go re je da da nyomoba bangu wa za nyomoba de la garesne de cha khonro nga ya an cha do an ji xie da la so ba an di so ya nyomoba shi di so ge di nam ge za wa de yun se de garesne di mu tian zi di mu tian ba zhu ba jin be da du zhu ba jin be da jin tian jin de le ji go re 제가 되는 자 녀모바 방고 녀모바는 싸와디 디무 다신디 방고고래 디무 다신데 방송바나 디 안에 띵한서 코알을 저투고래 디무 누가 유 군주 덴바 디무 다신데 방마도나 근데 코알에 녀모바 치자 방 털고 두고 말 녀모바모도나 코알을 저투고 말에 제가 당한서 코리아 유조디 되샤 시다 디모숨들이 되샤 시다 디모숨 디나 예다 되샤다 시다 니보디야 자와 디묵딘진 다신레드네 기고레 시다다 되샤 방고 시다 방고레 니 유자와 다신 마릭바데 방고고레세 방고고레세.
This morning, in the context of the Four Noble Truths, spoke about true sufferings which are to be known, and we spoke about that in some detail. Thereafter spoke about when one recognizes, truly sees what suffering is, one will look for its origin, its cause, and mentioned that this is contaminated karma, which is accumulated by its cause, the afflictions. So one needs to abandon karma and afflictions, but in particular, the afflictions. So the afflictions, there are a wide number of them. The most spoken about are that of ignorance, attachment, anger, and jealousy and pride. These all need to be abandoned, but amongst them, the one that has to be abandoned is the ignorance of self-grasping or the ignorance of true grasping. Because this ignorance is the ignorance that is the root cause of the other afflictions. So if to the extent one can suppress or overcome the afflictions, but not eliminate the ignorance of self-grasping, one will not be able to attain liberation. Even if one greatly suppresses afflictions such as anger and attachment, until the ignorance of self-grasping is eradicated, one will remain bound in samsara. Therefore, one has to eliminate this root cause of all our suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping or the ignorance of true grasping.
녀모바 탐지게 저의 중세계 규조와 다신 마릭바 세데 빵발라 되네 다신 마릭바 빵야게 녀모 가르공고 빵바디 빵바이나 되네 되네다 빵구구레 세디 제사상의 주민들이 군중 빵와자 세디송 군중 빵와자 세디 제사도 녀모 탐지게 저의 중규 군중 덴바 녀 다신 마릭바 빵구레 디방바이나 고방 운도 자스데 디방바이나 디네 냥데스 고텐세 토고레 민베 그래서 고텐 냥데스 타바세 토고레 고방 운도 자스 제자디 타바 토야라 나 람공바 자스 제자 람가르 공부레세 다 델레 다제 마리바 파에기 님보디 람가르고슨 다메 바토베 셰랍세디 디 공부고레지레다 제 다메 바토베 셰랍디 다 다신디기 님보 최고래 제자디 다신디 님보 디 다메 바토베 셰랍 공묘도 안디 공모 공대고도 페네 되니 딘신 다제 마리바디 방토고레지레 제자디네 자다 다메 바토베 셰랍 공부고레스 람공바 자사지
Again this morning, in relation to the Four Noble Truths, it was mentioned that true sufferings are to be known, true origins are to be abandoned. And the origins are contaminated karma and afflictions, in particular the afflictions. So when the Buddha taught that they are to be abandoned, that makes it clear there must be an antidote. Now, the third Noble Truth was that of true cessations, which are to be accomplished. So how are they accomplished? How are true cessations accomplished? It's through the abandonment of true origins. How does one abandon the true origins? Through the fourth Noble Truth, true paths, which are to be cultivated, to be developed within one's mind. So amongst the true paths, let's talk about the direct antidote to the ignorance of self-grasping. So if it's an ignorance, its direct antidote is going to be a wisdom. And as it's the ignorance of self-grasping, the direct antidote will be the wisdom realizing selflessness. So in order to abandon the root cause of all suffering and thereby gain liberation, one needs to cultivate its direct antidote, the wisdom realizing selflessness.
다센디 안 바투 말에 가서는 셰바 딜리바 제주도에 비게 셰바 안에 뉴바 침보쇼 오래 시다다 셰바디 남미한테 왕도 소바이나 진짜 셰바 제주도에 바 리도 말에 진짜 되네 자다 제주도에 비게 니 지게 동반이래 제주도에 비게 로 안에 지게바라 안데 신에서 두고 그래서 진짜 신에 줍 되네 띵해진 제주도에 비 신에 줍 되네 신에 줍네 되네 동반이 또 로디 제주도에 비 신에 뭐 줍제 되네 동반이 또 로도 공부를 뒤 공부이나 되네 자다 유모 바투 그래서 되네 자다 데 신에 줍고에 뒤차고 띵해서 삼대 신에 줍 되네 동반이 또 비시라 공부해야 뒤차고
Wisdom realizing emptiness is the direct antidote to our root cause of suffering, the ignorance of self-grasping. In order to develop the wisdom realizing emptiness, so that that wisdom has sufficient strength, so that this consciousness that is wisdom has sufficient strength to eradicate the opposing ignorance, the wisdom needs a companion mind to be cultivated. And that is the mind of single-pointed concentration or calm abiding. Because as we know from our own mind, our own attempts to concentrate, to meditate, our mind is very easily distracted. Our mind is not at all powerful. So for our realization of selflessness, for that wisdom to have sufficient power, it needs to be conjoined with calm abiding or single-pointed concentration. Only then will our strength of mind, the strength of our wisdom, be sufficient that it can eradicate the ignorance of self-grasping.
Onda dine ki da meba hawe di ngando kale khasho chade yore de tada nganzu ge da meba se de hawe de da kale khasho re chesada nganzu gi la da zin da meba ge do sho da nganzu gi le nyomo ba timu da zin se de nganzu le da du chuba ra da du chuba ji be da zin ji yore di nganzu gi hawe ya la ya ane kale khawo da dine di do cho da meba se de da meba to be shira di da meba to he de ya be kalek hashura chadiyore, chizande dame batobi sherab gyule kiyede, manzo kalek hashudi da chue chege nyamna chiga chue kalek hashudi chigre.
One can then understand the great importance of cultivating the wisdom realizing selflessness. However, it is not at all easy. It is the most difficult thing to understand within in the Dharma, the most difficult thing to deeply habituate one's mind to. So understanding selflessness is not at all easy. So developing the wisdom that realizes selflessness is not at all easy. To do so, one needs to also understand the opposite, our current way of thinking, which is believing that things exist by are self-existent, or exist by way of, are self-existent. So that needs to be understood in order to understand selflessness. But it is not at all easy.
이네 지상 다음에 봐서야지 맨날 가지고 지내야 생명에 반여와 또 봐지죠 또요 말에 네 그러니까 도면에 당한 저 가르요르세네 얘네 직 다음에 비게 되네시 다음에 봐서 되네시 라기리 세드기 다 연주에 빼제 먹고시면 암철 먹고 퇴 얘네 흉나려 되니게 다음에 볼 먹고셔야 되려야 직봐 퇴삼을 직 먹볼 지에네 안 소속이 아데네시 제 삼루라시 디초려야 삼루라 땅제 안데네시 인사에서 배다 흉루야 이시 흉나 손셔바지 근데 이시제당 라미 손셔바들 이시제야 소소란에 디와 삼나 어디 초어들 아데네시 인사에 삼삼마 마도 이시로 지지마도 먼저 체명해 봐 얘디 먼저 레요 말에.
So speaking here but in my own case, my own experience is that I have had the great privilege of studying the presentation on selflessness or emptiness over many years with really qualified, skilled teachers. And having studied with them many years, also reading further on my own and engaging in meditation on my own, I've come to develop a complete confidence in this presentation on selflessness. I'm yet, though, to develop a valid cognizer realizing selflessness. But because of my great fortune in this life to have met wonderful teachers and made great effort in my studies and my meditation, I have complete confidence in this topic, in this presentation, but am yet to give rise to a valid cognizer in relation to selflessness.
그래다 니네 자다이 되니게 이체다 되니게다 이체로 다시도 이걸 제거다 된데 이사를 선비게로 이체로 좀 거라 맞아 생명에 반해서야 되니까 내가 버려.
So I can teach from a perspective of this deep trust, but not yet from that of giving rise to a valid cognition.
야. 아드네 자당은 저게 다신세디 당보 먼저 디파 삼당고를 다시세다 다세는 가시고 소 가세는 소소라는 가시고 다시 제가 당은 전화를 소소된 나세베 삼로데 간에 쉬어래서 당보 디 심주치고 거를 디 야부하고 거를
When we talk about the wisdom realizing selflessness, we hear the word self. When we talk about self-grasping, again, you hear the word self. So we can use the word self, we can use the word I. And that, of course, relates to oneself. So the first step in the meditation is to try and get to recognize how the self appears to our mind. So this is the first step here.
아직 배기 잘라디는지 미드네도 지지 코데네도 세데 지 파셰레야 둠데오라체 소소인네 다시에서네 아트칼레하고 지시 아모와르시 치료인에서 어다 좋다데네데네지 파치 망고라시 하고는 소소인네 다로지 삼로 가르코게 베다 안에 지 짐바 같은 중국에 데네 심지어네 아자 아모와르시 네 강을 도와대거든요. 지다디네 로아미 아 수수수수이네 现在卷路现在南上通来了，所以卷里的通卡过来才够了，但还没了这，因进面这样子鸡蛋给的那做上来多几点给。
Before looking, it's a good lesson here that in terms of understanding the presentation, this is quite possible. In terms of seeing the validity in relation to oneself, this is more difficult. So this can be likened to how much more difficult it is to see the faults in our own mind as opposed to those of others. We hear how others are talking, see how they be behaving, and we can very easily recognize they're expressing this affliction or that affliction. And we can quite easily see the faults in others. But when we look inside, much more hidden, much more difficult to see. This is the very purpose of this process of meditation, is to come to understand one's own mind, to look within, not outside, but look within.
Dine samdada nga sosorare nga sedi dusine dusenga sedi samlastade ta du samdada sosu lolya nga sedi kandish du chid du lele samdade nga sedi sosu lolya nangde kandish nangdu sebe dusine dambo di samdango gore.
So the first step in the meditation, sitting quietly like you are now, to try and get a feel for how the I or the self appears to oneself.
제사다 로르야 nga 세르 로르야 낭투 낭타디 간디스 두 삼다데 당고도 생안주 삼나리야 두 스타데 갈바 가른난 거레스네 nga 세디 소수유 풍보려야 마되바 코론 풍보란 저와 메디게 코론 원이 루드바 신단 거레시레 다 풍보딜레 저와 메디겐 아니 지게 거 당한주게 풍보디 파 제비집데 나디 풍보디 파제 현在사부신의 제비야 유딩아 로시 데니스하네 당가디 응아조 삼로 나리아 데니시는 거레스 진짜 풍보리야 마되바 코론 풍보라 마되바 코론 외네 유에디바 로시 야 풍보레 마되바 셰바레 마되바 나레 마되바 코론 외네 줍디가 로시 간들이야 데니기 유에디바 로시 간들 셈레 는 거레지레.
When one looks, one will come to recognize that our I, our self, appears to be independent from our physical mental aggregates. Independent, in other words, not dependent on our physical mental aggregates, as something separate from them, distinct from them, and something that exists from its own side, it's self-existent. So this, again, I can say quite easily, but one needs to see it for oneself, that our sense of I appears as if it is independent, not dependent on our body nor our mind, but it appears to exist by way of its own nature, be self-existent.
Denigi na edukable denigi jezada nga sedi socio pomboda dene kanla ma de ba korong weni drubde ba ji yoba roji dinang yidu na samlo nalya na wa na shinji yore sambege nga sedi dene yore sambege zimba ji yore jingo re je di zimba de la dazin marik pa se di le wor da di zimba de la dazin marik pa la ge je jezang ando lo ya nang yidu nga di kanla ya warang gi pomboda kanla ya ma de korong weni drubde ba nan go res 진나와 나시 지가서 삼로디가 어디나 나디 되는시 요래 삼비게 짐바치요래 짐발 한기 짐바치요래서 와들이야 유디 짐바요래 니 짐바들라 다진 마리바 세디레다 되차 콘도 나게 뇨모바 샤상 얘기 다디 요새디 델레tin 용고래제래 제가 다디 다신디 마리바 디메바서 오고래제래.
What makes this challenging to recognize is we are being asked to recognize something we have yet to recognize intentionally. It says, whilst we continuously relate to the self in this way, we don't do so intentionally, but innately, naturally. But the mistake that is made is not just that the I, the self, appears to the mind as if it is self-existent, independent from the aggregates, but we then also grasp at it. Or instead of grasping, we could say, believe it to be the case. But again, this is all happening at a subconscious level, an innate level. So one grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears. So this is where we now come to understand this term. So the root cause of all our suffering is the ignorance of self-grasping. So spoken about the word self, now the word grasping. Grasping at the self as existing in the way that it appears. How does it appear? Independent. Independent from what? The physical and mental aggregates. So this is the root cause of our samsaric existence, and it is this that we need to abandon, the ignorance of self-grasping.
Denegi Dushine Samdane, that Denegi Ralia, Na said Lole, Nata, Lupa, Zindaidi, Dushin, that were Di the Retro, that Dene Haugen, Dene, Zinadi can sing to order, Kala Mado Rangun, Ruanawan, Dara Yore, some Zimbadida, Zingdua, and Bigida, Dignity, Manzula, and what the Hago or
This then is the indispensable first step. This has to be accomplished, but it is not at all easy to see first how the I appears. So one can say it or hear it many times, but one needs to recognize this vividly for oneself. And then one recognizes, and this is what I innately or naturally grasp at, the I existing in the way that it appears. So this is the indispensable first step, recognizing how the I appears, this I that one grasps at.
Denigi Dangan Nawan Hashin, Luciore, Sempi Zimba, Denigi Nawan Hashin, Nadida, that Nadi, that you Chikpai Simju or Kat Ganese, Simju, that Delaya, and that Naso Chungo, Chikashi, Dire, Simjun, and Denesia, Kashi, Denesia, and words in Alea, Midom, Willy Gore. Tambo Nadi, Denigin or Tashi, the Nadi, that was you can do me the Tashin, Kashi, Nadenisi, and Nadenisi, Denesis, and Lavamido, Willy Gore.
So this first step of recognizing that the way that how the I appears and that we grasp at it as such, this is indispensable, that we believe that I exists in the way that it appears. The next step is then to investigate whether it does indeed exist in the way that it appears or not. Because we're told it doesn't, but one needs to recognize this for oneself. The way that one can investigate to see whether the I exists in the way that it appears or not, here there are a number of ways presented, and one can invest in any one of these or number of these.
Hindu Jezan Da Saidi, Konawan Hashi Pumbo, the Kalama, the Koron, Dini Truptuba, Tahara Juri, Dakbari, Juayomare, Giayomare, Manziga, some Chikot, Denigi Koron, and the Pumbo di Pashi, the Koron Meva Chegmare said, the Dakbari, Juayina Joyman, Na said, Dusi Yore said, the killing Goria. Pumbo, the Kalama, Koron, and Chashi Chiayomare, Pumbola, Diomar, Koron, Dusine, Koron, Chike, Denis Yudes, Jizako Giayo Marcia Maris, you are called your dress Gayo Maris or the Gedina. Tanga to Pumbo de Guardores, Pumbo de Guardores. Jezadi Delia and the Tatumawa, this is conjugate Da Yores or Dinigi Yoba Gilia, Da Yobas or Manzi Da said, Kansa said, Pumbola, Jidiniki Kala, Modubo, Koromweni, Juedeba, Tapa, Timbu, you are into Mebati. Deniguna de la Casa Das, Da Yoba, so that is a Chiroba Da Yoba Mawati to Stini or Resor. Down the Navigation, Denis Yoma Resor.
When non-Buddhists do an investigation such as this, they will come to a very different conclusion. So they'll recognize that the I appears as if it is independent of the body and mind, of the physical and mental aggregates, and it also appears as if it is unchanging. So that's the second characteristic I've not mentioned thus far. So it appears as independent and unchanging. And then, so that's the first step. This is how the I appears, and then it's grasped at in this way, self-grasping. Then when they do the investigation, they come to a conclusion which the Buddhists do not agree. They come to a conclusion, this is how the I appears, this is how the I is grasped at, and this is how the I exists. This is correct. The I, the self, and again, maybe this is the soul, I don't know, but there isn't this word in Tibetan. It does not change. And it is independent of the aggregates, of the body and mind. The aggregates, of course, these change. The body will die. But the self does not. it never dies. It goes on from life to life. So when non-Buddhists do this investigation, they come to the conclusion that I exists in the way that it appears. The self exists in the way that it appears. It is self-existent. That is the contrary, the opposite conclusion that Buddhists come to, which is that the self does not exist in the way that it appears. It is not self-existent.
네. 어두시네. 당아제레 안주게 제바체나데 가르쳐버렸은 제사되는 대시 다 삼로나나의 마세 나야디 다 풍보나 셔셔 강라이 뭐 그런 거니 줍되어 쉬어봐 난고르바다 되네 징아지 요레스미 짐바디 예되래 다 되네게 짐마나 신하디 당아도 신의 여바인데 다 가와 요레스 안주게 수부의 치료될 요레베스 나로 요레 수부 나로 요레스 두신의 삼다베나 다 치료 여바이나 안주 수보다 마디바인자 나디시 샤샤 징 수부 파산다 줘야 여바치 수부디 샤샤 나코란 산달 줘야 여바치 고리베스네 단 되네 요고로와 풍벌을 제와메게 마디바 데메지인다 나디 파쇼 풍벌에 로소 지여바이나 얘네 풍벌디 샤샤 나 줘야 요고로와 대딩 안줄에 줘야 민도와데 안주 줘 파조마서 수부디 존마도 줘야 민도와 nga 조기래도 수보 조거래 nga 되게도 수보 되되네 nga 줘야 맞아 수보 되되되 nga 되게라 거로와다 이제 nga 파조 수조 직 내가 가르치네 엔직 수보디 조고도 수보 그게 딴 거와 제가 수보도 파샤지 제가 수보디를 맞대 봐줘 파샤지네 nga 코는 줘야 나 내가 미도와데 예반스다 제가 되네 삼다도 두세 삼다나 되네게 nga 세디 풍보디를 제가 매비게다 풍보의 로소직 현지파 풍보 치료를 풍보 나로면 봐 풍보 치료를 로소 매바로지 세버리 얘네 삼다베는데 풍보 로소 매바로 차기도 와 그래서 여바 있나 풍보를 바샤제 가사 코론 줘바네 풍보 가르치네 네 파셔들의 요가스 가면도 와 그냥 안도 라바딘 요바네 디라바 나네 디나고요 말 그래서 거기 제와스 가요 말 가가로 와 라바디 유나 디고교 마다 제자 라바디 유는 유쇼로 와 제가 난 디나신 제와 풍보디난 제와 균이 매되어 가디 풍보디 로스 줘베나 제가 라바디난진 고 풍보 콜나코랑 가와 줘베네 풍보디 대샤셔 줘셔야 차그로 와 풍보 가르치베네 아니 가들 고랑 가와 유나 제와스카메 차로 제가 디네 삼다디 나 디네 시민도 와다가 저기 그래서네 나 주위에 나 대여라비 풍보디를 띄우고도 하다 풍보를 맞춰봐지 마디 로소디 자야지 인간저 두시네 심주시네 니야요 말해
The first step of the meditation is to try to get a feel for how the self appears, which is as being independent and unchanging. So then let's come to the investigation. If we were to look for the self, where would we look? So we can start and say, well, I should either look here within my body or somewhere apart from my body. And if the self existed as apart from my body, separate from my body, perhaps outside, out in the bush, then let me go find it there. And again, this is of course all done mentally. One investigates. If myself was separate from my body, then I could be anywhere in the world, but without my body. That is not the case at all. I could be at my place of work, and my body could be on a place of holiday. That is not the case. Moreover, I can't say I am working, doing physical labor, when the body is doing nothing. So the self and the body cannot be unrelated. The self anywhere out there apart from the body. Like, for example, we have two hands. Whilst one hand can be in pain and the other can be free of pain, they are still connected to the self. So we could say these two hands are, in terms of the pain they're experiencing, are unrelated. The pain is in one hand, but not in the other. But we cannot separate the self from the body in this way, that the self is somewhere out there in the bush and the body over here, and then that self out in the bush is going on its adventures whilst the body sits here. This is not the case. So when we investigate, we cannot find a self that is apart from or separate or unrelated, disconnected from the body.
안두스티네 제바체베이나 땅아 세디 안주게 나 세디 지상 풍보를 뛰는 줍도 봐 지지 풍보를 뛰는 줍봐 수기 풍보를 뛰는 줍봐시 안디에 맞에 안주게 낭다 나 조기에 조마를 세는 수기 풍보를 구겨 뛰어마 뛰어봐 되는시 뛰어 제반자다 안주 나 세디 수기 풍보를 뛰는 줍도 봐 차고래 디마세 수기 풍보된 안주 셈리야 뛰어봐 차고래 제상 나 기부도라 된 안주야 소와 되기 되고주나 나 기부도라 그래 제자다 소와 능화시키어도 나 기부 면도라 그래 제자 디네사 나 세야디 소와를 봐 뛰어봐 안주기 소와 되를 봐 소와를 뛰어봐 낭시에발을 뛰어봐 수기 풍보를 뛰는 주바지 해서
So there we see that the self is not separate from the body. We can do the same meditation in terms of the mind. It's not apart from the mind. Then you come to the conclusion that actually the self is dependent on the body. So it may appear to us as if it is independent of the body, but in reality it is dependent. I can only talk about that, say that I am going for a walk if the body is walking. If the body is sitting and you're telling everyone, no, I'm walking, this makes no sense. The self is dependent on the body. So too with the mind. If you are describing how you are, you will be probably describing your mind. I'm quite good. I'm having a great day. Or, I'm a bit bored, I'm a bit tired, whatever it may be. And what we are doing is describing our mind. I am happy, I am unhappy. That is relating to the consciousness of feeling, whether a pleasant feeling has arisen or a suffering feeling has arisen. So therefore, we see how the self is dependent on both the body and mind, not independent of the body and mind.
제자다 나세디 나소수 나세디 소소라서 나세디다 소수기 류다 소수기 셰발이야 뛰네 줍디바지마도 랑기 류다 셰발라 가야 못여봐 줍바지 매발이다.
So therefore, the self is dependent on the body and dependent on the mind, not independent of the body or mind.
제자시 나 세디 우이니술라 당 우이니술라 간에 쉬어서는 랑기 류다 셰발라 파 뛰는 줍바지마도 마뛰어 줍바지 매발에 뛰는 줍바차들. 제자당 우이니수 디레 뛰는 뛰바차들와 대대신가서 삼만나라 가는 곳에는 나타도 삼타도 랑기 풍보다 셰바 간라 마뛰어 그런 원이 줍디바지 능고로와 제자디 나수디 너는 나데 너와다 그 매바 찍려야 유어버리는 거래. 제사디 나와나신 지가지 풍보다 셈나 차시 뭐도 강라 뭐도 나와나시 요래 셈비 짐바디다 로로시 차이래. 제사 강라의 풍보다 낭 풍보다 셰발라 뭐도 나지 요래 셈비 짐바디 로로시 차이다. 로노트리. 제사 나디 된고라 간에 요래서는 랑기 풍보다 셰발라 뛰는 주디바 차거래. 나중에 삼문 다진세디 가르친 거로서는 강나세디 풍보다 낭semla 강라에 맞죠. 그런 원인을 줍도 진 거래. 지상 우인이스디 미팅바 우인이스디로 록소 진구도와 제자디 다세 말이 바래. 제상 두신 다세 말이 바래. 제자디 록셰레스. 제상 그 진바나시 요르베스는 요말 나세디 바 아니 풍보다 랑게 낭 셰발바 뛰는 주바지 뭐마도 맞죠. 아니 그런 원인을 주바디 요말레스. 매반자 그 아니 간주기 진바디기 나세디 풍보다 나셰고 강에 맞도 그런 원이 줍디버 진바디다 론노트 로시 차디래.
So in reality, the self is imputed or labeled or designated by mind onto one's body and or mind. This is how it does exist. But this is not how it appears to us. How it appears is independent. But the way it actually exists is dependent. Dependent on imputation, labeling, designation by mind onto the body and mind. That is how it exists. So therefore, the way the self appears and the way that it exists are opposite, are contrary. It appears to be independent, but is actually dependent. So we see there that these two are completely opposite. Therefore, the self-grasping, the consciousness that grasps at the self as existing in the way that it appears independently, is contrary to reality. It's a wrong consciousness. It's an ignorance. And there we have the explanation of the full title of this consciousness, the ignorance of self-grasping. Why is it an ignorance? Because it's contrary to reality. This is not how the self exists. But the consciousness that grasps at it believes it exists in this way. It's a wrong consciousness and therefore an ignorance. So again, the self appears as if it is independent of the body and mind, but in reality, it is dependent on the body and mind. So therefore, the ignorance, that the consciousness that grasps at the self as existing independently is a wrong consciousness and ignorance, because in reality, the self exists in the opposite way, as being dependent on the body and mind.
Do some dance, do chen jeva some time, just a nga said you, Deshi, that it nga se pumbo, Gala, Mother to Banajin, Zimba, Zimba Digi, Zimba Nashinji, that Pumbo Chimjushi, the Pumbo di and nga said the Pumboda, similar doing the Juba Shesha, doing the Juba in Zada, Queen Matuba Kaya, Matuba, Rangun Juba, Zimba Nashinji, Tualaya, Galama, Rangun Juba, nga said Mindu Sembigita, Zimba di Mindu Simbis. Denige samloji mindu sembege tachi bigi ngebani bigi semla ngebani bachi kiyodu denige andela dam lodela dame boto lo le gore.
Seeing how the self appears, investigating and recognizing doesn't exist in the way that we believe it to. Therefore, the consciousness that grasps at the self as existing independently, when it actually exists in the opposite way, dependently, is an ignorance. Recognizing that and how the self actually exists dependently is now a consciousness in accordance with reality. It's a wisdom. Whereas an ignorance is a consciousness that is not in accordance with reality. So here, when one realizes that the self does not exist in the way that it appears, it is empty of existing in the way that it appears. This consciousness that realizes that the self is empty of existing in the way that it appears is a wisdom. And it's a wisdom realizing selflessness.
Do Senedi, Lo Gomche, Kazi, Nuba Shuk Cher Sindu, Chimbayne, Deshi, Pumbo de Gala, Gala, Ngadi, Gala, Rangun, Yoba, Res, and Zimbi Lodi, Nuba Chung 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 Ruore, the Nuba Chung Ruore. Jesa Dinigi, Dame about the Lodi, Yakaze Combina, Nubi, and Datu Tiba Simulati, Nuba Chung Chung Ruo. Jesa that, Dinigi Zada, Dame about the Lodi, Nuba Cher Doala, Zijipi Dingits in Go, Dingits in Dupche, Dingits in Yongo, and Donyi de Dongbani Dame Patella Donyi to Lodi Dingits in your Yish, that the Aje Gishu Dene, and Shila Sundi Dingits in Setcha, Gomche, Duchine, and they task in the Banco, he said. That by a Nyingpo Zo did his order.
Yes, that's all. That's in there. So here then, one has come to see firstly how the self appears, and then we come to recognize it doesn't exist in the way that it appears. I've been confused by this ignorance for so long. One now has developed a wisdom. And this wisdom which realizes selflessness is completely opposite to the ignorance of self-grasping. This meditation then needs to be done repeatedly over a sustained period so that one becomes ever more familiar with the correct understanding, the understanding that is in accordance with reality, because we are deeply familiar with this ignorance of self-grasping. So we have to repeatedly, over a sustained period, cultivate the wisdom realizing selflessness. And as we do, our familiarity with this wisdom grows. And as this mind that is in accordance with reality grows in strength, correspondingly, the contrary ignorance weakens. And to be able to radically weaken and eventually eliminate this ignorance, one also needs to develop the union of calm, abiding, and meditative insight, realizing emptiness. Because only then, when one has developed single-pointed concentration and developed it to the point where one can analyze, then one's wisdom has sufficient strength that it can finally cut and destroy this ignorance of self-grasping.
Denige nga rangwene drupa zimbi dazinti nipa chunshu drupa ina da duecha xie dan chado nyumomba diye chunshu rugorwa da denige ko zawa khurang la gyun ma nipa chunshu du deni ko nyumomba shanda diye kiyaye nyung zhuya da kiye nyar kiye ba ina nipa chunshu ya chi chagorwa beni xingzong ma so na nga zuki zawa de gyun shura deni yaga ya kiye ma tuba kiye duba ina zawa le gyun de yaga loma diye kam rugdwa Ndi nanshiri, chezanti dasen marikpa tsawa dili pa kon yenpo ten komyo de kon nipo chunshu chodu, nen duasha kiya nyung zhuya, kongzha kiya nyung zhuya, nyummo pa chazan kiya nyung zhuya di shakorwa.
So as just mentioned then, as one keeps meditating, cultivating the wisdom, realizing selflessness, the ignorance of self-grasping correspondingly weakens. As one side grows, the other side grows. And as ignorance of self-grasping is the root cause of all our afflictions, as it is weakening in strength, so too will the resulting afflictions. So ignorance of self-grasping has been likened to the root cause from which all our suffering grows. So just like if you have a plant and you hack away a little at the root, that plant is going to wither a bit. And as you hack away further at the root, that plant may even start to die. So this is similar. As we strengthen our wisdom and thereby weaken our ignorance, the afflictions that result from ignorance, they too start to weaken.
Gangsa nga se di pungpo dan chashe gangla ma du korong wen yun drupdeba nang she nang wang da yin daga da yore simbi zimba tila da gangsa da zin zimba ha se wore di pa yu deba dina di ki doksho ane chi damien ba di ma do ba ina dina dawa damien do ba dawa di kiyo ma le se wore zimba chuna dawa mi se dini ki nga se di pungpo dan gangla ma du korong wen yun drupa yu zimba di yore simbi samlo di da zimba se wore zimba 다신 마릭바세 디심 제자다 디도 저디 짐바 나신지 안 열라 유메 제바치네 디 짐바 나신지 민두 선배기 삼로지 네바 마주나 다와 미세 다메 다와 다메 또 다와디 끼요 말이에서 그래.
This explanation on how to cultivate the wisdom realizing selflessness, I've been presenting actually also the fourth line in our verse. If grasping arises, you do not have the view. Grasping is just what we've spoken about. Believing that the self exists in the way that appears. And this believing is another way to express grasping. Grasping at the self as existing in the way that it appears. So this is the grasping that is referred to, an ignorance of self-grasping. And to the extent grasping arises, you do not have the view being the correct view that is in accordance with reality, the wisdom realizing selflessness. Because this grasping, self-grasping, this is an ignorance, it is a wrong view. And this is what has governed us for lifetimes. And to the extent that grasping arises, one does not have the correct view, the wisdom that realizes selflessness.
Onda dinige gomche dinige dami ba tawadi gomche jeza di gomche ne nyomo ba bangu kore chin bangba ne tarba toguri es거다 jeza dini inzada dinige da deje di dami ba tawadi yabu gombala yabu gombala dambo ne tsurim soya tsurim dige shiso ne jimba da soba anda soba dini zönjuje mutije bejeje ga신 구병원에 zönjuje gomkoguri es jeza dini gombaina jeza dazin de bang 이 군주 다진 녀모바 탐지기 가서 동화 탐지 유 자와 녀모바데 녀모바게 자와 다진 말바데 방루고리스 디 방요도다 디 방수도다 자와기네 되니기 매바 수여제 디 자와기네 기에메 되게 디게게 뉴버 사본양 윤에 매바 수도 거래 디 저바나 단 사본나 제바 방 매바 수여도 방바시 그래 디 방요도다 데 타르바세 톱사레다 디네 타르바 톱사레자 디니 니 다디네 제리아 안 진이 동화다 강아디게 차사 다 게 유매바에서 된 동화야기 제고 동화야디게 차사 매바서 살해지 제사다 강아 대시 다정한 주게 그때 두비 게가 나시 동화세다 된 동화 뭐 삼매셔로 안디 세상 강아디게 차사 매바서 살해지 원래
So this then is the method by which one gains liberation from cyclic existence. One trains initially in ethical restraint, the very foundation of all good qualities, and adds to this immediately trainings of generosity, patience, and joyous perseverance, gaining familiarity with that. Then, when those trainings become conjoined with the determination to emerge from the suffering realms of samsara, one will continue in those 4 trainings, but add the wisdom realizing selflessness and single-pointed concentration. And when one has developed one's wisdom realizing selflessness to the extent that conjoined with single-pointed concentration, one can eradicate this ignorance of self-grasping, not just weaken it, but cut it. In other words, destroy the afflictions together with their seeds. They can never ripen again. Therefore, the cause of suffering is eliminated. Therefore, one will never suffer again. One is liberated from suffering. One is liberated from the realms of suffering. One is liberated from the realms of samsara. This is liberation. This is freedom. So what is required is to develop these 4 trainings, conjoin them with this required motivation, continue with those trainings to add to the strength of one's mind and the qualities in one's mind, and join that with single-pointed concentration and wisdom. Then the lasting, stable happiness of liberation will be achieved. And why is it lasting and stable? Because the root cause of the afflictions, of suffering, have been eradicated. Therefore, one can never suffer because the cause has been eradicated from one's continuum. In this way, all those various types of suffering that one has meditated on previously, so what was mentioned this morning, one is free from all of them. One will never experience them again, not even in a slight form, because one is completely liberated from suffering.
ngejun min side da kamson la shenba bang jene dene ane ngejun ke tarba twenye samba kinde lam gomche tarba togu guri esaje oduse dene za dang joge de sheba na jang da dushina sam gomsi dang samul dan shirwada samdai de shida ko barima shubene de sheba na jire da dang bo samdai de da nga joge 지기 고 연디 동아디기 파 삼다기 외도가 동아다 되네게 토네한다 지기 고 강아디기 파 도스도와스 되네 여러와스 되네 삼다 대냐와 이다 dun로디기 동아디기 디나데 취도여래 디나 차상 도시네 다 되네게 삼다데 어다 동아 델레데 타고도 다 델레 마트르반 탑메 델레 탈비게 타바세 톱고도 셈베게다 되네게 타바도냐게 삼다데 도시는 삼다디 당보디 차고로와.
So this then is the presentation on how to gain freedom from the 3 realms, the paths to cultivate. And again, this term path means mental paths, consciousness. So this whole training is done mentally. One first cultivates the motivation, that the required motivation, which comes about in dependence on reflecting on the sufferings of cyclic existence, of the three realms in their entirety. So here we think about the lower realms as well as the higher realms, leading to the point where we recognize there is nothing worthy of striving for, nothing worthy of getting excited about attaining, if it is something in samsara. It can never lead to the happiness we desire. So that's the first point, the cultivation of the motivation.
Denige taba togudu sembe da taba donige samlo kunwa diche taba togudu sembe da taba togudu sembe denige samlo denganzo yane 당진에 된 지금 고 검실 마스는 야 슈처서 고래 denige sam다에 되스 아주 좀 대도 왔다 도야 그렇죠. 다디 kunwa taba togudu sembe kunwa 안에 다 taba 토역이 된다라 내lun가 있으면 요건에 예수 자와기는 지금에 sembe sam다에 차고래 니바디 수름스고라도 수름소야 차고라와 디네게 수름소야 차고래 지사디 삼당매세 안디네 안능이 류론제 잔다리아바 권절이 최고표야다 신 동아세 디기두야리 신리아 진바땅이 선비게 삼라다에 차고 디 삼라다에 디네 삼단에다 디네게 쇠바 다 디네게 야 소설야 지생기 뇌바체다 디네 강아 제바 중반에 파 안에 콩러나지 파 지금 랜로야다 디네 콩러나지 파 뇌비게 랜레 뇌바기에게 디네 싸우기는 지금에 선비 삼다디체 안 디네 안 디네게 개회냠는 제데 빼 야고래다 디네게 무두시기 선비 디네 제야를 빼마서 야고인 삼제데네 가심 구바체 디네게 무두시기 선비 삼다디 준주세 다디 삼다디 저게 디바도 예중 삼 탈 코와라 아니 귀엔다 델레 탈도기 예중 코 타바 토고도 셈 군데 예중 삼 다야래 데네 추림소야 아니 진바 냠는지야 쇠바 쯧네 냠는지 디바도 언주기 됐을래라도 하는 삼단 다 토야지도 차기도 함
To recap some of the meditation, one needs to first cultivate this motivation of wanting to attain liberation from the suffering realms of samsara, which requires extensive reflection on the pervasiveness of suffering in cyclic existence. And each time one does this meditation successfully, it will lead not only to a recognition of that samsara is suffering, but that there is no happiness to be found in samsara. And then thirdly, therefore, I have to emerge from these suffering realms. I do not want to continue this process of uncontrolled birth and death, this remaining bound in this prison of suffering. And coming to these conclusions again and again until it arises in a way that is uncontrived. Then one has generated uncontrived definite emergence. In other words, one doesn't need to generated intentionally in a contrived manner. It spontaneously arises, ever present. With such a mind, then, the other meditations one is doing one becomes ever more focused on them. One is never distracted from them. In other words, one's other trainings, which I'll mention now in a second, when one's mind is focused on them, not drawn to any distractions of misconceiving suffering as pleasure and so forth. Then, not only does one need to cultivate this motivation again and again, but then also the actual paths that are required. The first being ethical restraint. So here, this is the commitment not to harm, not in my physical behavior, my speech, or even my way of thinking. Generosity. May give of myself, be of benefit to others in any way that I can in accordance with my capacity. Patience. I'll keep my mind undisturbed in the face of adversity, no matter where that adversity comes from, whether it's from others or from my own inner turmoil. I'll keep my mind undisturbed. Fourthly, I'll intentionally generate enthusiasm for virtue, taking delight in one's training so that one wants to evermore. So these are the first four causes to cultivate in addition to the motivation. These are achievable, so I encourage you to engage in these. These are much more achievable than the latter two causes. They are far easier, So this is where we need to put attention.
Dene samda dene 저기 dene ting에 sensi ne ting에 신의 주게래 신의 주고 거래 신의 주고 그래서 dene 신의 주네 저기 대시 셰바나진다 나다 세야지 다도 주바 세야도 요 말에서는 당은 저기 도신电되게 남샤 삼다시 아니 도신 셰바 제정 당보 대시 셰바나지 나세야데乱能가르치 난게도 나와 나신 간이 증유도 되는 진바 나신지 되는 두개 민도신 제바 전에 풍보라 되어봐도 마되어봐진 두개 민도신 제바 제제 도신의 제바 제고래 제바제 도신 제바진에 되는 담말이야 근데 되네기 나디 라라 나와 나신 나네 다가라 요르스 진바 나신지 민도신 비기 당해봐 예바지 제고래 디제바는 다음에 봐도 비셔랍게 기고래 다디 계산에 되네 네 수림다 진발로 소바는 냠는 제비 디텐에다 되니게 다음에 봐도 봐디 야네 야도 검제 안에 지게 녀모바 방고 녀모바 안에 사번에 제 방투고래 디 방반에 타로 토그레스 지나디 도시에 냠는 삼당고래에서 시순고 다지 차상은 저 삼루다야 그래도 와다 삼다도 오지네 제 삼루나네 제바제 삼다도 수수 당고래서 다 냠는 제세 디소로 삼다야 숨으로
Then the additional two trainings are that of calm abiding, single-pointed concentration, as well as developing wisdom, realizing selflessness. And that meditation as the first but difficult point of coming to recognize how the I or the self appears, which is as being independent of the body and mind or the physical and mental aggregates and being unchanging. Then looking to see if it exists in this way or not. Is this the self that I grasp at as existing in a particular way? Is that how it exists? Is it in accordance with reality or not? Buddhism says no, but I need to see this for myself. Then one does this by the second step. The first is seeing how the self appears, and the second step is to see, does it exist in the way that it appears? And we check, is the self then independent of the aggregates as it appears, or dependent? And we investigate in the way that I mentioned earlier, and we come to the conclusion. It does not exist in the way that it appears. The self is actually dependent on the aggregates. It requires labeling by mind. Therefore, the self-grasping is an ignorance because it's a wrong consciousness. It's contrary to reality. And this understanding is the wisdom understanding selflessness. And the more we cultivate this, the weaker our ignorance becomes. And therefore, as we are weakening the root cause of all the afflictions, the resulting afflictions also weaken. And this leads us in the direction of eventually being able to abandon the afflictions together with their seeds and attain liberation from cyclic existence. So this entire process I've described is mental. The purpose of Buddhist practice is training our mind. This is the meaning of Buddhist practice, training our mind. It's all done mentally. And then thank you. We can conclude there for this afternoon. Thank you.